October 16th, 1943. Rome had barely opened its eyes when the sound of boots rolled through the ancient cobblestone streets of the Jewish ghetto. SS soldiers were ripping families from their homes as a city thousands of years old watched in paralyzed silence. By noon, over 1,000 Jews would be forced onto trains headed east. But what most people never learned is this: just a short walk from the Vatican, an Irish priest was already planning one of the boldest rescue missions in Nazi-occupied Rome. A network so secret, so daring, that even the Pope himself might not have known its full reach. This is how a man armed with nothing but a clerical collar, sharp wit, and unwavering courage became known as the Scarlet Pimpernel of the Vatican, the priest who saved 6,500 lives right under Hitler's nose. Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty never expected to become a hero. Born in 1898 in a small Irish village, the son of a golf course steward, he grew up dreaming of nothing more than serving God somewhere quiet. By 1943, he had been living comfortably in Rome for years as a Vatican diplomat. He was charming, loved golf, stood an imposing 6 feet 2 inches, and spoke multiple languages with ease. To everyone, he was simply another priest doing his work in the eternal city. But when the roundups began that October morning, something in him snapped. The calm diplomat vanished. Rome under German occupation was a suffocating cage. After Italy surrendered to the Allies, Hitler's forces flooded the capital, turning it into a city policed by the Gestapo. The Vatican, neutral and cautious, tried to protect who they could from behind church walls, but neutrality came with a terrible price: silence. For Jews hiding in Rome's shadows, that silence felt like abandonment. Herbert Kappler, the ruthless Gestapo chief, set up his headquarters just blocks from the Vatican. His orders were simple: find every Jew in Rome. But he had no idea that his most dangerous enemy was already inside the Vatican, wearing a cassock and smoking a pipe. O'Flaherty couldn't watch any longer. He wouldn't stand by. He wouldn't wait for permission. He would use every favor, every friend, every ounce of Irish stubbornness to save as many lives as possible, even if it meant defying the Nazis and risking everything. What began as a single act of mercy soon grew into an invisible network of safe houses, forged documents, and escape routes threaded through the city. By the time word reached Rome's Jews, they had already started calling him something whispered only in desperate circles: the priest who never says no. The spark came days before the roundup when a terrified Jewish woman, Henrietta Kioval, came to the Vatican begging for help. O'Flaherty didn't hesitate. No permission, no meetings, no politics. He hid her family in a convent within hours. It was a small act, but it lit the fire. From that moment, he couldn't stop. He began recruiting priests, nuns, aristocrats, Swiss guards, even cooks and drivers. Anyone who believed silence in the face of evil was itself a sin. He even relied on Dahlia Murphy, the Irish ambassador's wife, who used her diplomatic immunity to carry forged documents and money across Rome in her handbag. Together, they built what later became known as the Rome Escape Line, a shadow network operating almost under the windows of Gestapo headquarters. The network needed more than courage, it needed structure. O'Flaherty turned churches, convents, and monasteries across Rome into hidden shelters, placing Jewish families in attics, basements, and behind carefully built false walls. He forged identity papers that transformed Jews into Catholics overnight, complete with flawless baptism certificates no Nazi officer dared to question. He bribed guards, paid informants, and used his Vatican diplomatic status to walk through deadly checkpoints as if they were nothing. And all the while, he maintained the mask of a quiet Vatican diplomat, attending dinners with Nazi officers, smiling politely, memorizing every detail of their routines, preparing to use their own habits against them. The operation grew faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, he was sheltering hundreds, and the number kept rising. But with each life saved, the danger increased. The Gestapo was watching. Herbert Kappler, the ruthless SS chief behind the roundups, began hearing rumors of a tall Irish priest who seemed to appear everywhere and vanish just as quickly. A man who was humiliating the most feared intelligence force in Europe. Kappler was a patient hunter, and now he had his prey. He began surveillance in late October, sending agents to watch the Vatican and track O'Flaherty's every move. But the priest was already ahead. He had informants inside the Gestapo itself, Italian clerks who despised their Nazi overlords and fed him warnings at great personal risk. He knew his phones were tapped, his letters intercepted, so he adapted. He stopped using his real name, communicated through coded phrases disguised as church matters, and moved through Rome in disguises that would have impressed a professional spy. One day, a laborer, the next a street sweeper, and sometimes even a nun, his towering frame hidden beneath flowing robes as he slipped past German guards with ease. Kappler escalated in November. Gestapo agents raided safe houses, arresting priests and nuns who had helped the network. Anyone caught sheltering Jews or Allied soldiers was executed. The message was brutal and clear. Stop, or everyone around you dies. But O'Flaherty didn't stop. He expanded. He recruited replacements for the captured, visited grieving families, and promised their sacrifice would not be forgotten. The psychological war reached absurd levels. Kappler, furious, ordered a white line painted at the edge of St. Peter's Square, the boundary where his power ended and Vatican protection began. Guards stood along it, waiting to arrest O'Flaherty the second he crossed. It was a trap, a challenge, and a humiliation, but O'Flaherty turned it into a spectacle. Every evening, he stood just inches from the line, smoking his pipe, staring down the Gestapo agents before calmly walking back inside. A silent reminder that Kappler's reach had limits, yet the line represented more than defiance. It marked the razor-thin boundary between life and death for thousands relying on him, and O'Flaherty still had to cross it. His rescues demanded it. Every step outside was a gamble. His escapes became legendary, his disguises so perfect that even friends passed him on the street without recognizing him. One favorite, a coal merchant, face covered in soot, pushing a cart straight through checkpoints while Gestapo agents searched for a towering Irish priest in clerical robes. He hid messages in hollowed bread, slipped forged papers into bundles of firewood, and relied on an unexpected army, Rome's street children. Orphans who knew every alley became his most invisible couriers, moving through the city unnoticed, carrying coded notes that kept the entire network alive. The operation was never just clever disguises or narrow escapes. It needed an infrastructure so massive that only a mastermind could hold it together. Ole needed money, food, rent for safe houses, bribes, forged papers, yet he couldn't exactly send an invoice to the Vatican treasury. So he turned to the most unlikely ally, the British Secret Service. Through encrypted messages smuggled out by diplomatic couriers, O'Flaherty struck a deal. He would shelter Allied prisoners who escaped Italian camps, keep them alive until Rome was liberated. In return, the British would secretly fund his mission. Soon, British gold sovereigns slipped into Rome through Swiss networks, and every coin expanded his web of safe houses. And these safe houses were works of genius. He didn't hide people only in churches and convents. He hid them everywhere. Wealthy Roman families opened their palazzos, building hidden rooms behind bookcases and false walls. A countess turned her wine cellar into a dormitory for 20 Jewish refugees. A monastery constructed a false floor under its chapel to hide Allied soldiers during German inspections. He even concealed people inside the Vatican itself, apartments technically diplomatic territory, but patrolled constantly by German soldiers. He moved people like pieces on a living chessboard, always a step ahead of Kappler. Forged documents became the backbone of survival. O'Flaherty recruited artists and clerks who could replicate German patterns passes, Italian IDs, and Vatican papers so perfectly they passed under harsh inspection. Baptismal records were invented, histories rewritten, and identities crafted for people who had never seen a church before the day they needed one. To him, it was simple. If lying saved a life, then it wasn't a sin. It was a sacrament. He kept every name, every detail recorded in a small notebook he guarded like his own life, but the cost was crushing him. He barely slept, surviving on a few hours before beginning another day of rescues. He lost weight, his face hollowing, hands shaking from exhaustion. Several times he almost got caught, once escaping a Gestapo raid by climbing out a window and sprinting across Roman rooftops like a character torn from a spy novel. His allies begged him to rest, to slow down, but he refused. Every day the war continued, people died, and as long as he could save one more life, he would keep going. By spring of 1944, his network had grown to more than 60 safe houses and sheltered thousands. But with size came danger. One captured operative, one intercepted message, and everything could fall apart. That moment nearly arrived when the Gestapo arrested Father Borg, a young priest running one of the largest safe houses. They found forged papers in his breviary and dragged him to Kapler's headquarters. For 3 days, they tortured him, demanding names, locations, proof that O'Flaherty was the mastermind. He never broke. On the 4th day, they released him, brutalized but alive, hoping he would lead them back to Ole. Instead, he confessed his sins, slipped into hiding, and became one of the hidden rather than the rescuers. His silence saved hundreds, but the message was clear. The Gestapo was closing in. Kapler shifted tactics. If he couldn't catch O'Flaherty, he would turn Rome against him. Rumors spread that the Irish priest was a British spy, that helping him was treason. Notices warned that harboring enemies meant execution, not just of the offender, but their entire family. Fear spread. Some safe houses shut their doors, but O'Flaherty had an answer. He visited every wavering operator personally, not to pressure them, but to release them. He thanked them, blessed them, told them no one would judge them for protecting their families. And something extraordinary happened. Almost none quit. Inspired by his humility, they recommitted even stronger. The network survived not through fear or orders, but because people believed in him and believed in the lives they were saving. The spring of 1944 brought a new crisis. Food. Rome was starving. The Germans were stripping the countryside bare to feed their war machine, and whatever little remained was swallowed by the black market, sold at prices ordinary Romans couldn't dream of paying. For Ola's network, now sheltering and feeding thousands of hidden refugees, this wasn't just a challenge, it was survival itself. Money could be stretched, clothes reused, beds shared, but without food, the network would collapse. Once again, Ophi turned to his contacts, this time to the farmers who still held loyalty to the Italy that existed before Mussolini and Hitler. Under the cover of darkness, wagons filled with vegetables, bread, and dried meat slipped into Rome, hidden beneath hay and firewood. Even monasteries turned their gardens into farmland, with priests and refugees working side by side just to keep people alive. The operation became a machine. Each morning, Ophi learned which safe houses were starving, which refugees needed to be moved, and which Gestapo patrols were planning raids. All day, he coordinated couriers, arranged payments, and stepped into the city himself whenever danger demanded his presence. And every night, he returned to his tiny Vatican room, updated his notebook, and prayed for strength to survive one more day. But time was running out. The Allies were pushing north. Liberation was close, if the network could hold on. Kapler knew this too, and prepared one final strike to destroy the man who had humiliated him for nearly 2 years. In May 1944, Kapler made his boldest move. He couldn't arrest Ophi inside the Vatican, and he couldn't catch him outside. So he tried something unprecedented unprecedented. He requested a diplomatic meeting, a supposed prisoner exchange, in reality, a trap. Everyone warned Ophi it was suicide, but he saw an opportunity. If he could meet Kapler face to face, maybe he could uncover something, some flaw, some weakness that could save lives. Against all advice, Ophi agreed. The meeting took place in a neutral building straddling Vatican and German territory. Ophi entered in full clerical dress, towering at 6 feet 2, walking calmly past SS guards who would have gladly arrested him on sight. Inside, Kapler sat waiting, cold, studying him like a scientist examining a specimen. For nearly an hour they spoke, not truly about prisoners, but locked in a psychological duel. Kapler accused. Ophi denied. Kapler threatened. Ophi reminded him of Vatican neutrality. Both men testing, probing, refusing to break. But the meeting had consequences. Unable to arrest him legally, Kapler escalated. He unleashed a wave of raids using informants to expose safe houses. In one brutal week, 8 locations were hit, dozens arrested, 3 executed on the spot. The network was bleeding out. To buy time, Ophi made a dangerous gamble. He began leaking false information through compromised channels, sending the Gestapo racing toward empty buildings, non-existent safe houses, and fabricated escape routes. It worked. Every wasted raid was another day thousands stayed alive. By early June, artillery thundered in the distance. The Allies were less than 50 miles away. Kapler, desperate and running out of time, prepared a final list. Everyone suspected of aiding Ophi's network. Mass arrests, executions, all meant to happen before the Germans fled Rome. It had become a race against time, and the fate of thousands hung in the balance. June 4th, 1944 began with an eerie silence over Rome. The artillery that had shaken the city for weeks suddenly stopped. German troops were abandoning the capital, loading stolen art onto trucks, burning documents, and preparing to retreat north. Even Kapler's headquarters was in chaos, but retreat or not, he hadn't forgotten his obsession. That morning, he issued one final order: arrest everyone on the list. SS squads spread across Rome in a coordinated sweep, raiding every suspected safe house before the Allies arrived. It was Kapler's last attempt to destroy the man who had outsmarted him again and again, but within minutes, Ophi was warned. His informants, now fearless with liberation hours away, sent urgent messages to the Vatican. The Gestapo was coming. The priest faced an impossible choice: stay hidden and watch his people be captured, or risk everything in one final race to save them. He chose the second without hesitation. He grabbed his notebook filled with names and addresses, tucked it inside his cassock, and for the first time in months, walked straight across the white line of St. Peter's Square in broad daylight. German guards watched, stunned, as he climbed into a waiting car and vanished into Rome's chaotic streets. What followed became the most daring 12 hours of his entire operation. As the city balanced between liberation celebrations and German revenge, he moved from one safe house to the next, arriving only minutes before Gestapo units. He used every trick he'd learned, splitting families to confuse trackers, moving people through sewers and alleys, hiding them in churches that had already been searched. At one safe house, he arrived to find SS troops already breaking down the door. Without fear, he approached the officer, introduced himself as a Vatican diplomat investigating reports of looting, and demanded to know who had authorized a violation of church property. His flawless German and unshakable confidence stunned the soldiers just long enough for the refugees to escape through a back exit. By nightfall, American tanks were entering Rome from the south. The German retreat had turned into a desperate flight. Kapler, realizing he had failed, fled the city in rage. But Ophi didn't stop to celebrate. While crowds cheered in the streets, he was still evacuating the last hidden families. Only on the morning of June 5th, when every last person was safe, did he finally stop. Against impossible odds, he had saved them all. The final count took weeks, but when the numbers were confirmed, they were staggering. 6,500 people, Jews, Allied soldiers, resistance fighters, political refugees, alive because one Irish priest refused to stand by and do nothing. He had turned the Vatican into an underground rescue network operating under the nose of the most feared intelligence agency in Europe. American and British officers wanted to honor him, parade him through the streets, pin medals on him, but he refused everything. No interviews, no photos, no recognition. He insisted the credit belonged to the ordinary Romans who risked their lives to hide strangers. When a British officer asked how he had managed to save so many, he simply said, "I was just doing God's work." But his mission didn't end with liberation. The war raged on in the north and refugees poured into Rome. Ophi immediately shifted his entire network from rescue to relief, turning safe houses into shelters, buying food and medicine with British funding, and working with the same relentless intensity as before. His collaborators begged him to rest, but he refused. Every hungry child, every displaced family felt like a personal failure to him. The exhaustion finally caught up with him in the summer of 1945. He suffered a stroke, his body breaking under years of stress and sleeplessness. When he recovered, he was no longer the energetic man who had climbed rooftops and outrun Gestapo patrols. The Vatican reassigned him to quieter duties, effectively ending his field work. The forced stillness devastated him, but he continued helping however he could, writing letters, advocating for refugees, staying connected to the families he saved. Then, in 1946, something extraordinary happened. Kapler, the same man who had hunted him for years, was arrested, tried, and sentenced to life for war crimes. Everyone assumed Ophi would celebrate. Instead, he shocked them all. He began visiting Kapler in prison. Once a month, he sat with the man who had tried to kill him, bringing him books, talking about faith and philosophy, and slowly, patiently trying to save his soul, just as he had saved thousands of lives during the war. For over 10 years, he continued visiting Kapler quietly, without publicity, without ever seeking praise for the forgiveness he had offered. And in 1959, as Kapler lay dying, the once feared SS officer who had terrorized Rome converted to Catholicism, baptized by the very priest he once hunted. It became Alati's final rescue, his hardest one. Proving his mission was never revenge or recognition, but a belief that even the darkest soul could still find redemption. By 1960, Hugh O'Flaherty returned to Ireland, worn down by age and years of relentless service. The Vatican offered him a modest retirement and a small parish job in County Kerry. He settled into a simple cottage overlooking quiet fields, worlds away from the Nazi chases, coded messages, and underground escape routes that had once defined his life. For a man who had saved thousands and outwitted the Gestapo, his final years were surprisingly silent. No ceremonies, no medals, no crowds. Parishioners saw only a tall, limping priest at their altar, unaware that he had once been the most wanted man in Nazi-occupied Rome. But the people he saved never forgot him. Letters arrived from Israel, America, Australia, grateful families telling him about the children and grandchildren born because of his courage. On painful days, he would reread those letters, reminders that his sacrifices and sleepless nights had mattered. Yet beyond those circles, his story faded. The Vatican, cautious about reopening debates over wartime silence, avoided drawing attention to individuals like him who had acted without official approval. So his role was reduced to footnotes, mentioned only in passing. O'Flaherty died on October 30th, 1963 at 65. His funeral was small, locals, a few Vatican officials, and no international attention. He was buried in a simple grave in Killarney, unvisited for years except by villagers tending the cemetery. The man who saved 6,500 lives died in obscurity, remembered only by those who owed him everything. It seemed history had quietly chosen to forget him, but such stories refused to stay buried. Survivors wrote memoirs, historians uncovered documents, and slowly the full scale of his rescue network came to light. Then, in 1983, the film The Scarlet and the Black introduced his story to millions, leaving people stunned that such bravery had been kept hidden for decades. Why was his story forgotten? Because it didn't fit any simple narrative. He was an Irish priest saving Jews, soldiers, and resistance fighters operating without approval in a moral gray zone. The British couldn't claim him. Ireland stayed neutral. The Vatican was embarrassed that he acted when they didn't. And so he slipped between the cracks. Yet his legacy lives on. The 6,500 people he saved grew into more than 100,000 descendants. Lives that exist only because he chose to act. In Israel, he is honored among the righteous among the nations. In Rome, a street bears his name. In Ireland, a memorial finally recognizes the hero they once overlooked. What makes his story powerful isn't just the scale, it's the motive. He wasn't a trained spy or a soldier. He was simply a man unwilling to watch others suffer. In a world overwhelmed by injustice, his life proves that one person with courage and conviction can alter history. He risked everything without approval, authority, or power, driven only by conscience, and in the end, he even chose forgiveness, helping redeem the man who had tried to destroy him. So when someone claims one person can't make a difference, remember the Irish priest who stood in St. Peter's Square, pipe in hand, defying the Gestapo. Remember the thousands he saved, the generations born from his bravery, and the truth his life reveals, that heroism is choosing humanity over fear, compassion over silence, and action over comfort. That is the legacy of Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, the Scarlet Pimpernel of the Vatican, a story that must never be forgotten.